Hi, I'm David Bollier, the director of the Reinventing Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I work as an activist, scholar, blogger, podcaster, and a kind of ambassador among different realms of the commonsverse. I try to make sense of the new types of social practices, economics, and cultural norms that commoning is bringing into being. Today, we're thrilled to have three pioneering commons activists and practitioners from different fields who will talk about their struggles and successes in opening up and expanding the frontiers of commoning, which I find a fascinating zone of emergence. This webinar is part of a monthly series of webinars hosted by the Schumacher Center to celebrate the 50th anniversary of E.F. Schumacher's landmark book, Small is Beautiful, published in 1973. The Schumacher Center for New Economics, founded 7 years later in 1980, works to envision the elements of a just and regenerative global economy. It focuses especially on its home region of the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts, but it's also internationally minded in its work and shares its expertise and educational programs broadly. To get us into the spirit of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful vision, let me start by sharing this quote from the book that remains as relevant as ever. Schumacher wrote, "Even bigger machines entailing even bigger concentrations of economic power and exerting ever greater violence against the environment do not represent progress. They're a denial of wisdom. Wisdom demands a new orientation of science and technology towards the organic, the gentle, the nonviolent, the elegant, and beautiful." The Schumacher Center sees this anniversary of Small is Beautiful as an opportunity to advance solutions that build on Schumacher's vision. Central to the 2023 celebrations of the book is this monthly series which convenes new economic thinkers, builders, and activists to share their latest insights and to propose actionable pathways towards a just, regenerative planet. Today's webinar is focused on the theme, Expanding the Frontiers of Commoning. We'll hear from three visionaries who are developing novel organizational forms and practices and infrastructures to extend the social dynamics of commons. They work in some very different fields: smallholder agriculture that's being improved by open source technologies, degrowth fashion initiatives that reject the colossal consumption and pollution associated with the garment industry, and local solar commons that are managed as trusts for the benefit of communities. These projects are showing how innovative organizational systems and tech design can empower people and respect natural ecosystems. Critically, they also avoid the harmful dynamics of global capital and corporate systems to secure a future of shared prosperity. Let me briefly introduce each panelist. We have Dorn Cox, a farmer in Lee, New Hampshire, and research director of the Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment in Freeport, Maine. He's a founder of the Farm OS software platform and the open source group called FarmHack, and more recently is the author of the book, The Great Regeneration, Ecological Agriculture, Open Source Technology, and a Radical Vision of Hope. A second panelist is Kathryn Milun. She's an community-engaged professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where she's developed the highly innovative Solar Commons project, a new archetype for sharing the benefits of solar energy with low-income neighborhoods and rural communities, Native Americans, regenerative farming groups, and community-based nonprofits. Besides her academic work, Milun is a writer and energy democracy activist whose work helps communities build locally sustainable and equitable commons. And finally, Sanda Niessen is a Canadian-Dutch cultural anthropologist and leader of a relatively new group, Fashion Act Now, an activist organization that's trying to break the dominance of growth-based industrial fashion and nurture instead indigenous, small-scale, sustainable clothing cultures, which is to say, clothing commons. Niessen's academic fieldwork is focused on the clothing culture of the Batak people in North Sumatra, Indonesia, which, like so many other indigenous clothing traditions, are in sharp decline thanks to coloniality and capitalist-driven global fashion. Let me say a few words about the format of today's webinar. We'll start with 10 minutes of remarks from each panelist. Each will describe their experiences in developing new sorts of commons and the types of challenges they faced, in aligning social practices, in developing new types of organizational structures, in making their commons compatible with existing law. Each panelist will also reflect on how their work may have been influenced or manifest the ideas of E.F. Schumacher as he laid them out in Small is Beautiful. Following the 3 opening presentations, the panelists are invited to ask questions of each other and to comment on what they've heard in the other panelists' remarks. I'll also ask a few questions to try to elicit some deeper insights into the path-breaking work that these commoners have been doing. And finally, we'll have an open question and answer session in which you, the audience, is invited to pose questions of your own in the chat box. We won't be able to get to all of the questions, but we'll try to get as many as we can. So, and then finally, we'll have some brief concluding remarks by each panelist in which they hope to address the challenges that they will be addressing in the future. So with that, let's just start with our first panelist, Dorn Cox, talking about his remarkably innovative work in developing open source technologies as a support infrastructure for regenerative agriculture. Dorn.
Well, thank you so much, David. I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity. I really think a lot about Small is Beautiful, if not daily. I feel like it's embedded in a lot of the work and certainly early inspiration in my own work. And I feel like it really resonates today as we look at the process of regeneration and agriculture as part of our climate solution, both in terms of how we need to adapt, but also what are the pathways towards mitigating and repairing the damage that we've done to our lands through land stewardship and empowering people to be part of the solution to regenerate our landscapes through appropriate technology. And so I see this as part of it is the knowledge commons, the agricultural knowledge commons that is necessary to engage in that as you're saying, those natural solutions, the organic solutions. The regenerative agriculture is knowledge intensive. It's about understanding the environment rather than enforcing an industrial system on top of it. So I think it really resonates. And I think the other thing that's really, I like the framing again here in terms of the commons, because we're asking, so much of what we're now asking agriculture for is not just providing adequate food, fiber, and energy, but we're asking for it to also produce these other public goods, from private enterprises. So, but these public goods like clean water, clean air, climate mitigation, biodiversity, and to help revitalize our rural communities, and alleviate things like wildfires, flood, drought, and mitigate global migration. So much of the refugee crisis are based on degradation of our landscapes. So I want to take and as you said, a lot of my work over the last 15 years has been in open source tools and technologies, taking the concept of the same kind of approach that looked at, taking the public science approach that was around the human genome, creating or understanding the human genome, or deep space exploration, this large scale collaborative efforts, and applying that to local agriculture. And also, which also actually, by the way, led to the governance institutions that made possible the open source software that runs the internet, which is a very large scale collaborative effort. But what does that look like when we start to apply that to our global knowledge commons around agriculture? How do we use that to share the appropriate tools and technologies, this global knowledge for our local production, this mutually dependent independence? And so I wanted to reflect back on some of what are the common roots of that, even that concept of appropriate technology. And I've been really inspired recently reading The Long Land War, Joel Gouldie's book, The Long Land War, which sort of chronicles the very early days of the FAO coming out of World War II and the process of reconstruction and decolonization, and a great deal of hope for what that might look like and is one of the very first UN institutions. And it was deeply inspired by Indian economists around the idea of land redistribution and appropriate tools and technology, and providing appropriate knowledge to transform that land into local economies at a small scale. And and this is really prior to 1970. 2 or 4, around when Robert McNamara took over and the World Bank took over into this other model, which was get big or get out, even before we saw that in the United States. But it was really an inspirational vision of mapping the world's soils and making that a public good, because understanding the value of the land and its productivity was necessary in order to actually redistribute it and get people to productive land, and then access the appropriate tools and technologies and create a catalog, a global catalog of appropriate knowledge. That was prior to the internet. So this was basically the equivalent of a card catalog that the ambition was, that was the original ambition. And I understand it was mentioned that Schumacher was inspired by those Indian economists who were spending, and development economists around some of these same concepts. And it wasn't lost on him, I'm sure, that like when Gandhi was referencing the sewing machine and the spinning wheel as being these incredibly powerful enabling tools and technologies that allow autonomy and local creativity to come through in communities. So I've been really inspired sort of looking at this longer trajectory, this long history of innovation, and recognizing that innovation is generational, and we need to create these mechanisms to have those big ambitions and the small innovations that come from the land be able to be built upon by future generations and reinvigorated and renewed. So when I see that happening now, and that's what's been I feel like it makes both I want to acknowledge the sort of the inspiration and the work that's been done, but it also gives us the opportunity to think, as we're building, how do we do it in such a way that other generations can also build on top of it? And I think that's one of the innovations that we have in this global commons, is that we have new tools for doing that. These digital tools that and we can do it in analog as well, and I think we should, but the ability for us to now access and communicate with one another and translate our ideas from one context into another at very low cost, at very high speed, is really remarkable. So I think how we govern that, and the tools that we have to really look to do that is really remarkable, especially in the context of something as complex as agriculture and agroecology. So, one of the things that I've noticed in terms of some of the forces that are pushing back is actually, even in that same institution of FAO globally, is the role of agroecology and innovation, and being brought forward as not as part of the solution, and that biological solutions are in fact the more advanced solution, that a lot of the industrial approaches to agriculture are the low-tech version. Understanding the biodiversity and the complexity of managing a complex ecosystem is part of the reason that industrialism happened, is they simplified it. And in fact, these more high-touch systems that are very knowledge intensive are really the advanced approach. And I think that's an exciting concept, and taking agency over it requires more work. So if we can ask more of our technology here, so we're not moving towards this notion we hear of, AI taking over the world. That's autonomous technology, as opposed to technology autonomy. How do we actually harness these tools and take control and governance over them for our purposes and for the benefit of ourselves and for the planet? So I think that's a really important aspect. So as I started, these are the kinds of organizations, these are the questions that have been motivating the formation of organizations like FarmHack, which is a direct lineage to things, to other catalogs of appropriate tools and technologies, but we're a modern worldwide community of farmers and engineers and designers to build and modify our own tools, and then share them and recognize that we become better at what we're doing by sharing and creating mechanisms to share our designs, tools, ideas, information, and inspiration. But from that, there is a global community. There are other, communities that are building out of those same concepts. You mentioned the PharmOS, which is a software platform to enable more detailed sharing of farm information and record keeping. But we've been the Gathering for Open Science hardware, the Gathering for Open Ag technology, and in fact, and open technology ecosystem for agricultural management are some of the more recent ones that we don't have time to get into here. But again, each of them has a different flavor, but again, even as they're local, they are the outputs are all globally accessible. And I would just say we recently recognized that the power that we have at this point is to start to connect these local efforts together globally. And recently just met in what we're calling in Italy about a month ago with a group that's called Grassroots Innovation Assembly, bringing together more than 20 of these similar groups from around the world, from India and Africa and Western and Eastern Europe and South America, to recognize how we're both common and how we share agricultural innovations, and then create voluntary governance to allow for, or federated governance to allow us to both recognize our independence and also the incredible contribution we can make to each other through that open exchange. So I'll leave it at that. I see I'm at time.
Well, thank you, Dorn, for that overview. We'll get into, I think, some specific examples when we return, but for the moment, let's move on to Sandra Niessen of Fashion Act Now. Could you explain your project, your larger vision of trying to develop a post-growth system of garment design and production?
Yeah, thanks very much, David. Hello, everybody, and I hope I'm not blasphemous here in the Netherlands this evening by saying that small is beautiful is very, very big. I appreciate the way the ideas in the book are being celebrated in this webinar series, and I want to thank all of the organizers for this opportunity to share what we're doing at Fashion Act Now. I'd like to tell you about our common market, a collection and a platform of fashion commons being developed by Fashion Act Now, the activist group that I belong to, based in London, in England. And you're probably already scratching your head. Fashion commons? Now, if you're thinking, isn't fashion all about showing off and supporting hierarchies of status and power? You would be right. Fashion commons appears to be a contradiction in terms, an oxymoron. And I hope to be able to alleviate some of this cognitive dissonance for you in the next 10 minutes. At FAN, we work on dismantling the fashion system. Participating in FAN, I've been excited to experience how a whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. And what I want to share today is very much the fruit of FAN discussions and working together. It's impossible to pinpoint the boundaries between the thinking of our individual members and that of the whole group. And many of the ideas that I want to share are the result of group discussions. Our ideas are constructed and held in common. As we agitate for what we call de-fashion, David already mentioned that, that's degrowth, sustainability, and radical fairness in clothing systems, clothing cultures. We try very hard to learn and practice what it means to be a knowledge commons. None of us is an expert in commoning, and we're learning while doing. Now, the place for me to start to explain our common market is with the distinction that underlies all of our thinking in FAN, and that is the difference between what we call big F and little f fashion. If fashion commons was an oxymoron for you, that's because you have big fashion, big F fashion in mind. And not surprisingly, few people know little more than big F fashion because it's been the dominant industrial system of clothing production and consumption on the planet since long before any of us were born. And recently, people have been raising their voices to decry fossil fuel fashion, pointing out that this highly damaging form of fashion is enabled by fossil fuels, not just for production, but also all the synthetic fibers that we're using nowadays. We at FAN agree, but we go much further. We point out that all of industrial fashion is fossil fuel fashion. Since its inception in the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, the entire trajectory has been enabled by fossil fuels, starting with the coal-powered steam engines. The use of those fossil fuels has increased exponentially, and fast fashion is only the latest stage in the trajectory. And while fossil fuels have been the true engine of industrial fashion, fashion theorists attribute the uniqueness of the clothing system in the West instead to a higher stage of cultural evolution, to more sophisticated civilization, and to racial superiority. In short, the sheer power of fossil fuels went straight to our heads and puffed up the ego of the West. The term fashion was co-opted for the clothing of rich sophisticates who could afford rapidly changing styles, while the rest of the world merely had clothing rooted in tradition. So there you have it, the dark side of fashion lurking behind every catwalk, every fashion magazine, that vertical binary, the industrial forms versus the non-industrial forms. That's simple. And so fashion has been celebrated while all other clothing forms, including peasant, tribal, and foreign, have been erased, ignored, undermined, and considered unimportant and bound to disappear. So I think you can see where I'm going with this. On the one hand, the unseen, erased, carbon sequestering, local, small f fashion expressions, and on the other, the growth-based, destructive, industrial, fossil-fueled fashion that's ballooned out to dominate the clothing scene worldwide. And of course, our thinking has been dominated by industrial big F fashion, informed by what our shops are filled with, catwalks, fashion magazines, the styles of the rich and famous, and on and on. Small f fashion doesn't even appear as a blip on the screen, except maybe when it's dubbed handicraft. This blinkered view of big F fashion also dominates the framework of sustainability in fashion, which is entirely oriented to reforming the industry. Now, we at FAN place little hope in the industry becoming sustainable. Why? Because it's growth-based, fossil fuel-based, and by definition, rooted in the unfairness of erasing small f fashion expressions. Long, thoughtful, soul-searching discussions amongst FAN members have led us to a fork in the road. Would we choose the extinction rebellion kinds of strategies of visible and audible protest against the fashion industry? Or would we choose a path of building and supporting alternatives to big F fashion? And with the wise counsel of David Bollier, our host, in our ears, And the clear-sightedness of Sarah Arnold, our coordinator, we chose for building and encouraging alternatives. In other words, to showcase small f fashion. And this makes us unique amongst activists for a better fashion world. There are a lot of groups out there brilliantly critiquing the fashion industry, and make no mistake, the fashion industry must be dismantled for the well-being of people and planet. But here's the thing, when big F fashion comes down, little f fashion has to be there, ready, resilient, regenerative, small and beautiful, free, fair, and alive. Hence our common market, that interactive platform that we're building to connect, encourage, and support small f fashion expressions. This includes a whole array of community groups that repair, share, repurpose their clothes, farm to fashion initiatives like Fiber Shed, now in many countries, not just the States where it originated, the Linen Project in the Netherlands, groups reviving or maintaining their clothing heritage, such as communities in the Ukraine that have produced and decorated clothing from homegrown flax and wool for generations, and so on and so on. Zoe Gilbertson, one of our fan members, is researching bioregional bast fiber knowledge and is plugged into its revival in the UK. Another member, Ariel Fabro, in Vancouver, has constructed the website Cobbled Goods to profile sustainable shoes made with respect to nature. Respect for nature. We've constructed ground rules, we call them the Common Code, for participation in our common market, so that the communities that we onboard are not big F fashion wannabes waiting for their chance to scale up, but function rather as commons in which the common good and fairness, not profit and growth, are central. We hope to offer a forum that will eventually generate a significant groundswell. Will our common market result in some kind of solidarity? Will the communities learn from each other and support each other? Can we collectively become a commons of commons, or a kind of what David Bollier calls a vibrant republic of commoners? That's what we hope and aim for. Our path will be made by walking on it. We have to trust to the group dynamics that will take place. We know that many challenges lie ahead of us. They will need to be solved iteratively within and through our communities, through trial and error, and through deep discussion. Differences of language and culture, differences of vision and strategy will need to be bridged. Inside and outside Europe, there are countless groups struggling to keep their fashion traditions alive. We want to serve not just as an alternative to big F fashion, but also as an antidote by providing a space where small F fashion communities can find each other, support each other, shine, feel pride, revive, and flourish. In short, to re-emerge from 200 years of erasure. The loss of these systems is not something to shrug off and feel that they're doomed by modernity. It's absolutely crucial that they be supported. First, they provide alternative understandings of how fashion can operate for the good of communities, and this is desperately being sought now by fashion reformists in the northern nations. Second, they're part of the process of becoming sustainable in the north. The process of being sacrificed by the continual expansion of big F fashion needs to be reversed. They need to be granted the space to survive. Third, we hear so much about the loss of natural diversity in the 6th great extinction, but cultural survival is a problem equally profound. That is part of the polycrisis too. Wade Davis made a prediction 15 years ago that within a generation or two, we may be witnessing the loss of fully half of humanity's social, cultural, and intellectual legacy. My time is up. But suffice it to say that I have found profound, even mind-blowing meaning invested in indigenous Indonesian clothing systems maintained by indigenous cultural commons. Indigenous systems of dress, not just their appearance, but also how they're made and used, are imbued with what Schumacher referred to as psychological structures, and in turn are profoundly linked to cultural survival. I'd like to end with a quote by Schumacher as follows: "The life and work and happiness of all societies depend on certain psychological structures which are infinitely precious and highly vulnerable. Social cohesion, cooperation, mutual respect, and above all, self-respect. Courage in the face of adversity, and the ability to bear hardship. All this and much else disintegrates and disappears when these psychological structures are gravely damaged. A person is destroyed by the inner conviction of uselessness. No amount of economic growth can compensate for such losses. This is what I've been seeing in Indonesia, and that's why I've become a member of FAN." Back to you now, David.
Wow, thank you for that inspiring talk, Sandra, and very illuminating of that territory. Well, we'll get to some follow-up in a moment, but let's hear from Kathryn Milun and her remarkable work in developing the solar commons as a different kind of structure, community-based structure for meeting the needs of people as commoners. Kathryn.
Thanks, David. Wow, that was amazing to hear, everybody. I'm really honored to be here together with my colleagues who have found the term commons and the concept of small is beautiful to be enabling of their activist work to keep economic sustainable, and beautiful. I'm going to share screen right now while I talk because I want to show you some of the tools that our project has built. So let me just take a second. And somebody can tell me if this is the screen shared, everyone?
It is. Why don't you just begin the slide to get the big screen?
There we go. Is that okay?
Yes, that looks beautiful.
Great. Okay, good. So I'm a legal anthropologist who's been using key ideas of commons and appropriate technology design for the past 15 years to create a local economy tool with solar energy. I started the Solar Commons project to co-create and prototype free open source tools that would provide in underserved communities a way to capture and manage what Schumacher would call commonwealth from the 21st century energy transition. So I'll show you Solar Commons tools that create a 20-year revenue stream that can support community wealth building. Like the idea of a universal basic income, Solar Commons allows us to govern solar technology as a 20-year community basic income. But before I describe how Solar Commons work, I want to make a cultural observation that connects the concept of commons to Schumacher's work on appropriate technology. I think this is an observation that's shared in food and energy and probably and clothing commons work as well. But after I show you how the solar commons work, I really want to distinguish how different this energy commons work is from food and clothing commons work described here. So I read small is beautiful as a call to integrate what the classics called the good, the true, and the beautiful in designing economic solutions that avert the great derangements we now experience in the industrial scale design of modernity. Anthropologists call this integrated world-making work cosmology. If modern industrial food and energy systems reduced the power of beauty to advertising and restricted the good to the rational, then Schumacher's appropriate technology movement, combined with historical thinking inherent in commons movements, provides the antidote to what the Indian philosopher Amitav Ghosh has called the great derangement, which is the naturalization of modernity rationalized infrastructures and scales of provisioning within globalized capitalism, as my colleagues here have described. So here is how the Solar Commons Project uses commons and appropriate technology design to create a community economy tool. Starting on the left with a look at the electric bill of a solar energy owner. The yellow is the significant savings that the owner sees on their bill. The savings that come from the sun, the savings can be used then to pay off in year 4 a loan that they took out to build the system. Thereafter, the savings become a 20-year gift from the sun, what Schumacher would call commonwealth. So the next 3 icons here show how a solar commons works with those solar savings. Neighbors find a local building owner who agrees to install solar and agrees to share the free solar savings. They use a community trust agreement to create rules to share the savings minus the system costs. And they use a digital dashboard to govern how the savings are used to better their neighborhood. So now I'll go into a little more detail about how 3 tools of the Solar Commons the 3 tools we use to shape photovoltaic technology into a system of commons governance. First, the Solar Commons Agreement is a legal tool that uses trust law to obligate the solar PV host to share the equity in solar savings with a local underserved community partner. The community partner creates the purpose of the trust to serve its needs. This is a charitable trust, so even a donor can fund the technology for a solar commons, instead of a loan, and the donor would get a tax credit and get the Commonwealth revenue streams flowing right away, not just in year 4. So as far as we know, there is no other such shared equity community solar trust ownership model in the US. But if there is, this is a call out to everyone right now who wants to start working with us to prototype this. So this is the second tool that the Solar Commons uses. It's a digital dashboard, which is the publicly facing commons management tool that makes visible and transparent the flows of value in the system. Right now, this is a screenshot of our basic dashboard prototype that calculates solar savings based on the rules of a Solar Commons trust agreement. This particular dashboard is populated with 1 year of data coming from a 500 kilowatt solar system that's designed by students at the University of Minnesota campus for the campus to be the solar host. So up in the right corner there, left corner, the yellow box at number 1, that's where the university host will enter some numbers from their monthly electric bill. Then the dashboard will populate the screen with a calculation. And then at number 2, you see kilowatt hours of clean electricity produced. In the blue there, you'll see avoided CO2 emissions. The dark green is the market price of the solar savings that are now on the bill. And then in light green, those are the solar savings that are sent to the trust after you deduct for system costs. Then the pink area of the screen at the bottom, the community beneficiaries post pictures and stories about the community wealth building work supported by the Commonwealth funds. So for this dashboard, engineering and anthropology students designed a 3 megawatt rooftop solar array that would help our campus meet its 2030 solar mandates. And they put in a 500 kilowatt solar commons carve out that would generate about $70,000 a year for 20 years for the trust beneficiary. So you can see that in the light green box on the right by where the pink arrow is. The students proposed that all 5 university campuses, you see this now on the far right, those 5 campuses could support they could provide a long-term revenue stream this way to support the food sovereignty work that Indigenous peoples are doing on the ancestral lands where each campus lies. So it's a really simple design that I think exemplifies Schumacher's Commonwealth economics. It would be no cost to the public university, and it would save tribes a lot of time wasted on grant writing. I have to add that these students won first place nationally last spring with this design for the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar District Cup Collegiate Design Competition, and we're super proud of them for that. So this is the third tool then. This tool is the public art tool. This here is a mural on the wall of the local elementary school located in a low-income neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona. This neighborhood is receiving the Solar Commons Trust benefits of our first grid-connected solar commons. That's me standing in the corn just for a sense of scale. This is a 14.5 kilowatts, so small, behind the meter system on another building in Tucson. It's about $2,000 a year annual to the trust. So it's small. The way we're doing this is the kids in the elementary school use a participatory budgeting process to distribute the funds. The mural then also is there, is the kind of world that they have helped us create to depict what this means. So we created this Solar Commons game to teach guiding principles of reciprocity and such for the kids in their budgeting decisions. We think of the public art then as the community's deed to equitable title of the Sun's Commonwealth. Equitable title is a legal right that trust law has to empower beneficiaries of a trust. We make it visible in the art. And as Schumacher urged, we make it cosmological. This community ownership connects the good, the true, and the beautiful in its very specific realization at this neighborhood site. So the two scales of solar common that I've showed you here also exemplify Schumacher's economic insights. When the Rocky Mountain Institute analyzed the financial ownership model and the scalability of solar commons based on this Tucson project, it found that solar commons should not scale beyond a 500 kilowatt size. If it did, it would start taking money away from the trust to cover increased administrative costs. So I hope we can explore that appropriate technology aspect of solar commons in our conversation today. These findings are really in sync with economic findings of David Graeber and other economic thinkers who track increases in administrative sectors of our economy, like finance and insurance. They note how administrative growth extracts common wealth from individual workers, households, and communities, and make that wealth flow upward to managerial and executive classes. What I'm showing you here, solar commons work by a range of 500 watts smaller. Finally, it's important to note that these cosmology-making tools of solar commons that are otherwise missing from the history of modern energy systems, including electricity. And that's really important because that makes solar commons face a challenge that food commons and I think clothing commons workers, designers, in my experience, would not face. So the food clothing designers, as we've heard here, they can tap into pre-industrial cultural forms that provide insight in designing smaller scale solutions to the derangement of the industrial food or clothing system. A food shed design, for example, can reference a historical past of local farm community institutions that include harvest festivals, celebrating cooperation, church, small business, civic groups, and other cultural institutions that are cosmologically integrated and can thus effectively bring people together to celebrate and care about each other's well-being. But if you design relocalized energy shed economies like we are trying to do now, you're going to have exactly the opposite. You bring in energy technologies still shaped from the industrial fossil fuel era, without culturally integrated forms of local governance, without cosmological frameworks, without ways of seeing energy technology as other than simply an efficiency machine. And this is why the 20th century electric grid that connects our current energy system, arguably the largest machine ever built, continues to set the standards for what is good, true, and beautiful in energy solutions work. It's good when it has centralized control. It's true when it powers an economy based on growth and investor ownership. And it's beautiful when you don't see it. Because we don't have historical presence to see otherwise, industrial scale design principles dominate even solar technology, which, as I've shown you here in the Solar Commons project, actually has the potential to be shaped as a local common good, a measurably true kilowatt, and a beautifully integrated part of our 21st century life worlds. So, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kathryn, for that wonderful and quick overview what sounds to be like a very complicated project that you've evolved over many years. I'd like to, one of the cross-cutting themes that I seem to have heard in each of your presentations is trying to get the appropriate scale for your endeavors, and very much in the lines of Schumacher, who it reminds me of a quote that I happen to have handy here. Somehow we've lost touch with one of the fundamentals, namely, what is the proper scale of things? And when the scale is wrong, then there's violence. And I think we see that in all three of the fields each of you work in. I guess my question that I'd love for you to reflect on is, how do we assure that appropriate scale when there's so much money to be made from scaling up into some globally unified system? What are the legal systems? What are the cultural practices you need to do to try to keep things localized or at an appropriate scale for maximum respect for the environment and benefit to the community? I don't know who wants to start with that one.
I'll jump right in there because I think scale is so important in the agricultural space here, as we've talked about, and even the concept of scaling up. A big part of the conversation at the grassroots innovation assembly I mentioned was really focusing on the concept of scaling out. Like, how do we take these concepts and share them globally, but really implement them in these localized solutions? Because again, some of what our innovations and our inspiration can certainly be global, but the actual implementation is incredibly localized and does not scale up. It needs to be customized. It needs close observation to local details and cultural contexts and so forth. So I feel I really resonate with the tension between those two things really daily, is this sort of this local autonomy and sovereignty, food sovereignty and data sovereignty and control, and our ability for collective impact, which requires coordination and organization and governance. So I think the federated concepts and are really important, where we're able to, and in fact, even the word, as we were walking through bringing together these different organizations from around the world, the word assembly was really important, that we are voluntarily organizing, but the governance is really at the local level. So I think that doesn't fully get at it, but it's something that we're really certainly working on a daily basis with. I will note that there are some things that do require some level of centralization to enable communication. If we're studying the effect of improving soil health, that is global knowledge. That's part of the global commons. It is the same, the understanding the microbiology is, and the tools we use can be applied globally. And likewise, language translation is something that we all have to work on together to be able to communicate across large scale geographies, to enable us to have the benefit of each other's work. So there's some big things that I think require sort of centralized collaboration. But I think there's some real I think it needs to be kept in context. And I'll say one more thing. I'm speaking quite a lot on this because I think you've really touched on a nerve, Dave, and I'll hand it back over. We have there are two principles that we've been designing a lot of the tools with. One is FAIR, which is an acronym for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So those are principles for open access tools, technology, science. But there's another one which is about the autonomy, and it was developed by the indigenous, by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and that's the CARE principles, which are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics in technology. And those are really about the opposite, which is really the keeping your the food sovereignty, local sovereignty, and control and autonomy. And I think they are not exclusive. I think they're directly dependent on one another, that in order to be able to freely share and build that commons, we need to do that from a place of security. So
let's get some other perspectives on that. I mean, I'm struck by the deep tension there, because the more global and expansive you get, the more the temptation is to try to roll that up or privatize it or monetize it versus to maintain that local autonomy. But I'd be curious to know, Sandra and Kathryn, let us speak from your perspectives to that question.
Sure.
Go ahead, Kathryn.
Sandra, go ahead. Oh, okay. So this, I think I have a pretty good, really physical example of this. It's so true in my area that when the scale is wrong, there's violence. What's happening now with the rollout of wind and solar is in rural areas in the United States. I'm just going to speak, but I know this is true elsewhere. This is a big giant megawatt solar farms, gigantic farms. And usually there's a complaint about, NIMBYism, that, so many of these rural communities don't want, this giant, hundreds megawatt solar on their prime farmland. And oftentimes progressives say, these are, people against renewable energy, they're MAGA, Republicans, and etc. In fact, we really need to understand why it is that they're resisting giving permitting in these areas by local communities. And anthropologists have studied and know that in some cases that if you change the scale and the ownership structure, and that's really important, ownership structure, if you can make the benefits of the solar flow to the community. And so not just the benefits of a, several hundred megawatt scale that flow to the tax base, but it's owned by someone else, but actually the ownership, so you can actually have a say in how big you want that system on your land. So once you connect then that ownership and the size together, you have a different look of how solar or wind is going to go into the rural community. So yeah, I think that's a huge area for us in energy transition, to bring those thoughts of Schumacher in and to think together, not just about scale, but scale and ownership, which is basically governance and decision-making on the benefits.
Thank you. Sandra.
Very interesting. I'm really enjoying this conversation and listening to these other examples. We are dealing with fashion with an area, I spent so much of my 10 minutes explaining the difference between big F and little f fashion. That's been something that's, we've worked on for a long time, because the little f fashion idea has just been so obliterated. We think of fashion, we think of industrial fashion, period. That pre-industrial fashion is just so long ago, it's not even in our collective memory. And when I go, say, to Indonesia, and people talk about fashion, it's kind of like the success story. It's where they want to go. And it's an ambition that seems to have been built in by coloniality, which is, the last 300 to 500 years.
So how do you reinstill the sense of a more localized, landscape-rooted garment production and design?
Well, this is the key. And listening to Dorn, I hear a lot of similarities, commonalities. We want to be really careful about how we're onboarding. And we have a questionnaire, or at least a questionnaire. Yeah, people have to fill in how they respond to the common code. We have a common code that stipulates people that are going to be on, or communities that are going to be onboarded onto our common market, have to have a certain relationship with nature, have to have a certain relationship with economics, with community, and so on. so that onboarding is simultaneously a kind of educational process. It's awareness raising. So when I started off with that Big and Little F fashion business, that's what will actually emerge, is that during the onboarding process, they'll discover, hey, our small size and the fact that we're not going international is actually a plus in this case. Somebody actually wants to support us the way we are. And that dualism, actually Schumacher talked about that as well. That's in the minds of the people, the weavers that I work with know very well that they have amazing skills. And they also know that those skills are regarded as unimportant. So when they find that somebody will support them, that will be awareness raising for them. So I see the whole thing as a process of, then you've got that tension between us central in London based and the communities all around the world. We don't want to be the gatekeepers. We don't want to be, just blowing the whistle all the time. What we are hoping for is a groundswell amongst the communities through their interaction amongst themselves. We want a pluriverse. We don't want some sort of monoverse that we're dictating. So that tension, I think, between the forces of history, the past, will always be in conflict or at play with what our intentions are with the common market. But at the same time, we're aware that we have to morph with the market as it grows. So that's the road that's made by walking on it. There's got to be education, there's got to be empowerment, there's got to be some rules. And presumably, David, if we can do this in 5 years' time, we can share a whole lot more, because I think Dorn and Kathryn are both farther ahead than we are in our project. We just got funding, but the onboarding process starts now.
Well, you raise a question that I think all three of you could speak to, which is, how do you deal with the tension of the source of investment or money in the first place to get the project going, and keeping the convening principles the dominant governing force, so that, for example, if things appreciate in value, there's not a temptation simply to liquidate and cash out. How does the Commonwealth be kept inalienable? And for the participating members, how does this not simply become a enabling structure for capitalist extraction at some point? I mean, that's a big question, but I'd love to get your reflections, because it's such a recurring theme in so many commons. Go ahead, Kathryn.
So, I really am going to take to heart what Sandra just said about the road is made by walking on it. And I want to say that for Solar Commons, that what is right now in solar energy and how it's rolling out. And to get it to be that cheap as a technology, it involved huge amounts of investment in various things. So, I mean, that is where we are. And I think that dashboard I showed you basically shows you the types of value that the Solar Commons as Commonwealth has to be communicating with. We see there ourselves, right there next to the market value and the, and then the ecological value of CO2. So anyway, we're right there. And I think that right now, at this point, if we can have a carve out, of a 500 kilowatt system in some big otherwise extractive system. So if Walmart is going to put a megawatt of solar on their store in a blighted neighborhood, then they could do a 500 kilowatt Solar Commons carve out and share some of those savings with the local neighborhood. Then they can use art. And because of the tools, we try to create the tools so that the purpose of the trust is set by the community, and various other bottom-up ways of governance that hopefully will, so it doesn't just become a greenwashing or a advertising tool for Walmart. It actually is a way of keeping some of the wealth local. But otherwise, I think that is a key problem right now with solar here, is that we're in a very big system, but we would continue to be, as Sandra was talking about, really mindful of the, for example, in the global South, of how microgrids and solar is going in at community scales and community ownership, village scale ownership, and what that is teaching us about governance and about the technology.
Let me just underscore a fact that you showed that beautiful mural, but I loved how you once explained to me how that represents a deed to equitable title by the community. And I love the idea of a public art exhibition or mural or something like that being the community's expression of their moral and legal title. And I mean, it just takes it out of the realm of lawyers and courts into the community itself and becomes acculturated and internalized. So I just wanted to accent that. But Dorn or Sandra, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Lots of questions, or no, sorry, both questions and comments on that, David. So this is definitely something that is not theoretical in the realm of agriculture right now, because of the incredible interest in or the role that agriculture plays in mitigating and adapting to climate change. It's globally, the amount of capital that is about to flow into agriculture as a natural climate solution is staggering, and orders of magnitude more than has flowed in before. So there's a real risk and a huge opportunity to test out what we're calling sort of transformational finance, which is really looking at how funding from corporations, governments, private individuals, and also from community funding can actually flow into mechanisms that are actually funding the public good and create a governance and charter where I think the trust is a really important term here. Use some of the existing legal frameworks, but transform them into trusts for the public good, trust for beneficial agriculture. So I think that's that concept of transformational finance and moving into community governance response, those structures that are then responsive to the community needs. In fact, there was an attempt to do this actually after the Dust Bowl in the creation of our local conservation districts, were intended to hold large amounts of capital that were going to come in to invest in agriculture accountable through a non-governmental or quasi-governmental process to prioritize what actually happens. So again, it's another example where there was some good thinking that worked somewhat, but I think we have an opportunity and imperative to try again in how we can do that and harness that. I'll also note that we're seeing that there's some of this that's happening right now with other modes of exchange and ways of financing, even the internet around the edges. We see the things that we often value the most are the things that are often sort of marginally funded. Things like, Wikipedia, for example, is sort of, I think, is one of the purer forms of what the internet should have been, and the finance mechanism for how that actually is maintained. And a lot of the core infrastructure that actually makes it work is like that, and it's ad hoc. We did not design a system to actually sustain the underlying infrastructure, and so what we get are a lot of the things we complain about because we're relying on, again, the commercial interest to fund the minimum amount of the common infrastructure in order to sustain the commercial internet. Imagine if there was in parallel essentially the shared knowledge utility that was maintained for public benefit. So I think they share a lot of, and a lot of that is invisible and basically there, but it hasn't been called out. So I think there's a real opportunity, but it does require transparency in transactions and an ability to essentially create some toll mechanisms for that. One more thing, because I think it's really important, is that so much of what when we think about finance is based on this transactional type of relationship with what we're funding. And I think a lot of the commons work that we do in agriculture and intersection with software is in alternative modes of exchange, where there's social value that's exchanged that helps create and maintain it. There is a joy in sharing and reciprocity that's created that is equal, if not greater in value than the exchange, than the sort of the direct monetary exchange. And not that you can't do them independently, but you can strategically structure organizations and relationships and recognition of roles and governance and responsibility and attribution and appreciation as a way of building really large scale efforts. And so it's easy to sort of diminish that. And that's sort of like why you sort of really beautiful meals and food and conversation at organizational gatherings. Like, those are the things that can really go a very long way. So I think when I have an opportunity to say, to sort of call that out, I think it's really important as an economic and an organizing force to add those additional social goods.
I agree. That's entirely under leveraged. I like to use the term relationalized property and relationalized finance to point to the personal relations and love and traditions and rituals that everybody has about shared wealth in a commons. And you're pointing to that as trying to leverage that so that it's not just a transactional relationship of somebody trying to amass as much money for they can individually. So let's just move on quickly to Sandra. If you have any thoughts on that question of sources of money and investment while trying to maintain the spirit of commoning and shared benefit.
Yeah, I mentioned that we had just gotten funding, not a whole lot, very, very minimal. We've already decided that would not be in our interest to be a central body that disperses funds to the members in the group. What we really want is to create a forum, and that the group, the collective of communities that joins us will talk amongst themselves about how they want to profile themselves, use the community for their for mutual assistance. So again, it'll be relational. The whole thing is, we're not a money-making venture. We call it our common market, but there is nothing going to be happening with regards to sales. So it will be entirely about communities coming together to talk about their issues and so on. That will require funding. Certainly our website will require funding and so on. I'm actually getting a wonderful inspiration from what Kathryn has said, because maybe we should start with solar panels to put it into our community trust. But so far, David, we haven't run into that problem yet because we're not that far along, but we definitely have talked about not wanting to be an enabling structure for capitalist extraction.
No, I mean, you will undoubtedly have to learn how to develop the alternative supply chains that are not simply based on maximum market growth among all the players, and, alternative distribution. Those will be another frontier for investment, I'm sure, that in a commons friendly system.
So, David, I have a question I'd like to ask of both Sandra and Dorn, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Just on this, what you've just said, all of us are using digital platforms for this relational engagement work. And I mean, I don't know, when you think about David's question about the, and what Dorn was saying about who's built that platform and how much it really costs to operate it and run it. And I know, for example, we're thinking of, should we host our dashboard kind of the way the time banks do, as something, kind of for everyone? Should it be on the GIS ARC platform? Where is the platform for it to be? So we're not contributing to how much is pulled out of that platform for actual administrative costs. What is a real administrative cost and what is fake? How do you find out, because you have so many proprietary systems involved here, what actually is a legitimate cost that you want to deduct? So has any of you, and I know David, you work in that realm too, so are there particular kinds of platforms that would be more beneficial to others? And then you would state that on your platform that, this is what we're doing and this is what we're supporting.
Well, I'll jump in because we're directly working with an organization called Terran Collective that is building out an alternative to Facebook and other sort of, and organized around pro-social principles called Hilo. So we and some of our partners like Regen Network also are moving not all of our internal operations. A lot of us still use Slack and Zoom, and even we use some alternatives internally, but for efficiency and cost perspective, we're in a transition. I think this is sort of the transformational moment, but they're real, like so we're working with them particularly to reflect some of these community organizing principles and group structures that scale or bioregional scale and allow for the kinds of organizations that are reflective of place-based communities as well as communities of practice. So I think there's some really, I definitely recommend looking at that. And and it's given us the opportunity, because it's a product of the community, to focus on some of the community governance aspects that are really important for decision making, because a big part of creating transformational finance is the governance of what's the charter for that fund to do? How are they going to be reactive to changing conditions and demands on the ground? For what are we going to invest in? What feature comes next? What practice on the ground deserves, what tool should we prototype that has a lot of interest? And so I think there is a huge opportunity for digital tools to be oriented around, rather than creating conflict, to actually elevate where we have consensus and create a sort of more efficient, I say efficient, but but a better reflection of community will, sort of intense, or we say what's the term?
Collective wisdom.
Yeah, well, there's collective wisdom, but you also allows for the kind of voting sort of intensity of. It allows for different methods for reflecting your intention of the community. It can be very creative.
Perfect segue to an audience question. We should move on to some questions in the chat from the audience. And one spoke about, this is from Lowe's Latemia. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name properly, but referencing a book by Julia Watson called Design by Radical Indigenism, in which she sees analyses of indigenous systems as social and sustainable innovation. I think that maybe it really would be worth us focusing on community-based local innovation that is situated and specific as something that needs to be elevated and honored in its own right. And indeed, the innovation cycles can be faster and more appropriate than what the centralized conventional corporate innovation cycles are all about. I mean, then that gets to a question of how do you finance that? There's another audience question raising the question about should the public capture of economic rent be a way of financing local commons? So that's a general set of questions, but I'd love your responses to those ideas of both innovation and maybe some sort of public financing for local innovation.
I'll give an example of the indigenous, of innovation coming from the landscape and from land stewards directly. Very much sort of the impetus behind FarmHack, in fact, was both reviving existing tools and technologies and documenting, and sort of that generational process of not only inventing something new, but looking to and elevating and renewing innovations that have already happened. And it was one of the more inspirational things in our assembly gathering I mentioned earlier with the honeybee network in India, which has a very formal, long-standing process pre-internet, really, of sending out the equivalent of an extension, but they're really a process of actually and intentionally going out to elevate local innovations and giving national recognition to those innovations from villages, and creating a system that was that values rather than extracts in that process. So I think there's a really wonderful example in that honeybee network for being and that's even in the name. It's sort of this beneficial pollination or cross-pollination that they're trying to set out, and it's been replicated now. I learned not just in India, but in Colombia and in Indonesia and China even. I guess there's some pilots for that same system.
Dorn, before moving on to Kathryn, could you restate the name of that collective you mentioned a moment ago?
The Terran Collective.
Terran.
With Terran Collective with Hylo, HYLO.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that for anybody listening. Kathryn, maybe you could speak to that issue as well, and let me fold into the question while you have the floor of how your scheme differs from, say, conventional solar co-ops, which is another audience question.
Yeah, that's great. Rural electric co-ops share, distribute the benefits of solar, when you use solar. And right now we're working with a rural co-op that is generation distribution. So they own the generation of the solar and the grid it goes into. It's amazing. We're trying to measure right now, actually, what are the costs if you own the grid and the generation. Because this co-op, for example, it takes 4 days for them to interconnect their solar to their grid. If I have a privatized, investor-owned grid, I'll say Excel Energy here, and I've got a third-party solar trying to get in, even when we have a law now that allows that in Minnesota, it might take 4 years for them to get integrated. So what are the real costs? And we can't find out because they're proprietary. But here's an example, David, of what I think, what could work on the grid. All grids are in right-of-way. These owners, they can own assets, but they don't own the land underneath. They own a right-of-way, which is an agreement with a county, a city, or something. And the right-of-way is a public good. So to ask how the public good could be helping in financing, all these agreements have availability for fees. Fees could be raised, for solar commons. You're going to use our right-of-way. You could use some solar commoning tools and put some of that money back into that community using those those tools that are very public facing and visible making of the actual values. And the other thing is you could have a policy piece. You could say that in our 100% renewable energy action here in the state, we're going to have 3% of this be solar commoning. So the grid, anybody using the grid is going to meet some kind of mandate to do this, a really visible way where you demonstrate the value is back in the community in ways that community control, not just at a city or county level, but actually at the community level. That can happen also in cities, in urban areas as well. So that would be an interesting public financing.
Although in fairness, we've seen the failure of that with respect to cable television and using the rights of ways as a point of leverage. So that implies we would need a different politics, or commoners would need to get their act together to press those claims.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sandra, I don't want to bypass you if you have something to add there, but otherwise we'll get to some other questions from the audience.
David, we're not far enough along with all the specifics of internet yet. I do just want to point out that innovation is, of course, what fashion is all about. And any kind of technology that's even intermediate technology that's brought into a community that's an Indigenous community actually breaks down traditional innovation structures. And so one of the things that I'm very concerned about is the giving of room for so-called traditional technologies, simple technologies that maybe even Schumacher would not have looked at, because he was interested, in the end, he was interested in a linear progression towards some kind of development, and intermediate technologies were a path that would kind of bridge between the northern nations and the southern nations. But I think when you come to the commons, you're working with a community wisdom, you're working with communities calling the shots rather than some kind of linear progression. And then what it's all about is creating room for design innovation from the community.
That's a really profound point that I'm glad you raised that, because in my experience of looking at lots of commons, it is simply having the available space for people to identify their needs and move on them. I mean, that was the paradigm of open source software years ago, of there being available space to scratch your itch and develop the systems you wanted. And I think so much administration of activities here is so instrumentalist that it doesn't enable that bottom-up creativity to surface in the first place, even though there are plenty of creative ideas grounded in the local landscapes and ways of life there that need to be developed the way Indigenous cultures have done for millennia. So, well, you can speak to that because you've studied so many of those examples.
And that brings us back to the issue of the internet again as well. It's going to exclude a certain number of people or communities, and it will shape the thinking of communities. We are talking about also alternative ways of connecting people within our communities, so that it's not all done on the internet, but there will be on the ground actual, without the internet, communications. Very, very important.
Why don't we move into the final? We're nearing the end of this this webinar. Maybe we could, each of you, have a minute and a half, 2 minutes max, maybe some summarizing thoughts or takeaways that you have from this conversation. And also, if you could just name some of the serious challenges you want to address that you think are important for the expansion of your types of commons in the future. Why don't we start with you, Dorn, really quickly?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think the points that were just made towards the end in terms of how do we organize and finance, and I think build on some of the Indigenous examples that that require multiple modes of exchange and relationship to manage these, both centralized as well as distributed, is really one of the big challenges, and that we're at holding that tension constantly in those things that we do in very small groups autonomously, and the things that we're trying to do together in larger groups. And then, of course, touching on how we go through this transformational finance process to, governance is sort of gathering feedback from that process and moving resources to support it. So I think that's continues to be the area that we're going to focus on, as much as we're working on individual tools and appropriate tools and technology. It is really the governance process and the transformational finance to support and finance that commons infrastructure to enable that not only to exist, but to sustain itself and to thrive and be intentional, not a byproduct a happenstance from the industrial system, but intentionally sustained. So from my perspective, that's the great challenge. And I think, but I also see some hope in moving in that direction. And I'll close also on Sandra's point that I think that structure should reflect how we, like what we, again, this is sort of the technology autonomy, is that we should not take for, we shouldn't think of the internet as the way in which we work. We should create what we want and work from that. So have it reflect the best of how we organize locally, and then make sure that the structures we build reflect that, rather than try to fit ourselves in the other way around.
We've seen through so many social media and big tech platforms that there's infrastructure, and then there's commons enabling infrastructure, which has a different design, different purpose, different impact. So,
Right.
Kathryn, why don't you continue the thread here?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Dorn has just laid out about the issue of the centralized and then the distributed. Specifically, well, first of all, I'd like to see solar commons simply be the little machine that you add to power what Sandra's doing at small scales, and it's a revenue creating stream. And the kind of work that the farmers that Dorn works with are doing. So I'd like it to see something you can connect to that, those communities. But the fact is right now is that you need a stable host. The technology allows 20 years, let's say, of it requires 20 years of stability for somebody who's going to host the solar. And you need a stable institution. I'm working right now with very vulnerable communities as beneficiaries. They are not, how do they enter into as a beneficiary a 20-year agreement? They may be gone in a couple of years because of the economy. So our agreements and things like that have to be flexible enough and know who to create agreements with, so that we really can have stable institutions that are there, that are going to need electricity, being able to share. And so again, that tension between the the community that's going to get the benefit and then use it for and govern it for their own very specific good. And then the other part that's very stable and centralized that you actually need for a solar commons, for example, to work.
Great. Thank you so much. Sandra, some concluding thoughts.
Okay. Initially, I think we were asked to talk about the next 50 years, what we'd like. Just prior to coming into this webinar, I got an email from Claire Farrell, one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, who's been fighting a court case, the state versus XR in terms of some of their activities. And she defended herself and won her case, reminding me that the whole reason I'm here, the whole reason possibly all four of us are here, is that our globe is in a terrible crisis. We know that the next 5 to 10 years are absolutely critical to our future. To talk about 20 years of stability is a very difficult thing to talk about given the current state of our climate. I wanted to reflect again on Small is Beautiful, that Fritz Schumacher was looking at eliminating poverty, encouraging peace through intermediate technologies. I see colonialism built into his thinking of then, certainly also certain amount of patriarchal structure. We tack on now saving our planet, very, very urgent. And I have found so much hope in the concept of the commons. So I want to see Schumacher now in Small is Beautiful in combination with the commons and not separately. I think that's the way to go forward. we have a time crunch, and what we've been talking about is absolutely critical.
Well, I want to thank all of you panelists for joining and sharing your stories and insights. And thank you, audience, for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. I just want to leave by saying that next month's panel will take place on Thursday, December 21st. The theme will be Regenerating Local Food Economies, Feeding 8 Billion. You can be on the lookout for further information and registration details through the Schumacher Center's e-newsletter and social media website or social media communications. So again, thank you all for joining us, the panelists and the audience. And this will be posted online for people who may want to review parts of it in the future. Thank you again.